might be unnecessary to see my face because I'm going to be with you in this conversation. So I'm going to just welcome you to my kitchen and put you in a spot where you can see the ingredients and hear my voice. And then we can talk a little bit while the dough is rising. So welcome to my kitchen. I'm Rabbi Schulman. I am here on Erev Rosh Hashanah morning, getting my challah ready in the way that I probably would be anyway, although far more organized and put together. So I'm going to put you on a little stand and show you all of our ingredients, and then we'll get started. Okay, here we go. So this is a recipe that I have found from an organization in Los Angeles called Challah Hub, and it's a vegan challah recipe, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a minute, but you'll see that it's lacking the ingredients that would make it not vegan, and it's including some ingredients that give it some richness and some fluff and some texture. So first things first, got all of our ingredients out here. I'm going to move the flour over. We know that it's flour. We're going to start with a small bowl. And in the small bowl, we're going to put 2 1/4 teaspoons of yeast. So in the recipe, it calls for 1 packet of yeast. I only have the big jar. So I've been using, I Googled and found out it's approximately 2 teaspoons and 1/4 teaspoon. So we go ahead and put those little guys, or they are not vegan. Yeast is vegan. I don't know. We put the yeast in this small bowl. And then we add a pinch of sugar, something for the yeast to go to town on. I'm gonna need a fork. And then we add 1 cup of warm water to this concoction. Move it over here so you can see what we're doing. There we go. Yeah. We add the water, and I like to stir, as I'm adding. Makes me think I'm doing the right thing. But we're basically just giving the yeast a little bit of a party to start activating. And then we're going to set that aside. The recipe calls for 5 minutes. So let me ask my robot to time that for us. Alexa, set 5-minute timer. Fantastic. So we're going to let that sit for 5 minutes, and the yeast is going to start doing its thing and partying. And then in a separate bowl, we're going to combine 3 tablespoons of coconut oil. Now, you may say, but I don't like the flavor of coconut. I don't either. No product placement or anything, but any triple filtered coconut oil that you can find, I've been using for all of my vegan baking, and it doesn't taste like coconuts. It just adds a real lush richness to whatever it is you're baking. So in this bowl here, we're going to add 3 tablespoons of coconut oil. Yeah. Okay, and then we're going to, this is the one thing I am going to measure out together. We're going to add 3 tablespoons of water. 1, 2, can you tell I have a toddler? 3 tablespoons of water. I'll let that go hang out in the sink. And then we add 2 teaspoons of baking powder. And again, with the fork, I'm going to sort of whisk it together as I mix the baking powder in. Come on. I like to get all of it in there so that it does its job. Mix it together. It'll get this nice kind of milky white view happening. And, people say that baking is more science and cooking is more art. I am neither a scientist nor an artist, but I really enjoy baking, and I kind of figure once you put the things together in their proper proportions, they kind of do what they're supposed to do. So we're going to set this over here too. Now, if I weren't doing this, Food Network style, I would take these 5 minutes that the yeast is activating to measure everything out. But because I've done this Rachel Ray style, I have our 3 cups of flour already measured out. So some people sift. This recipe doesn't call for sifting. I use, I don't even use bread. Well, I do use bread flour, unbleached bread flour, but I've also used just like all-purpose flour for this, and it's turned out okay. I like King Arthur because it is non-GMO and it's certified B Corp. If you look on the side of the bag and you see that B, it means they really care about the environment. It's non-GMO, which is all part of vegan way of eating. Yeah, so 3 cups of flour, and then we have half a cup of sugar, and I think I accidentally measured out a full cup of sugar, so I'm gonna just take my 1/4 cup measuring cup here, and here we go. More sugar than we need. 1/4 cup of, oh no, half cup of sugar. Maybe I did it right. Oh, friends, I haven't really had nearly enough caffeine yet this morning either. There we go. So we measure out our sugar. There we go. And then to this mixture, we're going to take the salt. So 1½ teaspoons of salt, fine salt, whatever you would normally use for baking. Great. Then I'm going to start to just combine all of that with a heavy spatula. I was a baker in my early years. My Grammy Souther was a baker and would have me over to her house all the time to bake. And then I sort of took that to my house, and I would just use whatever spatula I could find, and that was great, and you know, kind of make do. And then fast forward to 2020 and COVID and staying at home and baking more again. I discovered this really heavy spatula, which if you have a heavy spatula, I encourage you to use it for mixing dough together because it gives you some weight and some heft to what you're doing. So that's our dry ingredients. Let's see how much time we have left on the yeast party. Hey Alexa, how much time is left on the timer? Perfect. Alexa, cancel timer. Alexa says we have 30 seconds left. Sorry if I just activated your device. So we're going to go ahead and continue with the yeast. So you take the yeast party, and then you take 2 tablespoons of coconut oil. So there's coconut oil in this bowl, which I call bowl 2. And then you're going to add these separate 2 tablespoons of coconut oil to bowl 1. Ooh, that looks pretty cool. We can get a better view of that. Alexa, off. Great. So take my fork and kind of mix up the yeast and sugar and water and coconut oil. All right, so this is bowl 1. Now we're going to start to mix everything together into the flour. So I like, the recipe calls for adding bowl 2 first. So bowl 2, lest we forget, is the baking powder and coconut oil and water. So just swirl it around to kind of get it moving again. And then I'm going to add it to the flour mixture and start to bring it together. Now it's clearly not enough moisture to really bind the flour, but it's a start. So you kind of, as my mom and other grandmother would say, you sort of mish it together. Oh, hang on, dog needs to go outside. Okay, Nelson. What'd you say? Animals, we'll talk about them in a minute too. Then take bowl 1, which has the yeast and sugar. Add that in, kind of scrape the bottom to get all the little yeast packets, little pouches in. Okay, now we have enough moisture to really start bringing the dough together. So we're just gonna put in the elbow grease to bring it together, and it's gonna be wet. So we start by really just combining flour off the sides. This is where the heavy spatula really comes in handy because it gives you just a little extra oomph in getting your dough together. And then in a minute, I'm just gonna dig my hands in there, which are clean. I washed before we began. Remember, always before baking, cooking, wash your hands, like I need to tell you in these times in which we find ourselves. All right, it's starting to come together pretty nicely for me. Now, we're gonna keep the bag of flour handy. That's why I like to keep all my ingredients out on the counter until I'm done bringing everything together. And we're going to grab some flour and sprinkle it in, maybe more than we really need. Let's see. And then we start to mish. Oh yeah, that's sticky. So you want your dough to not stick to your fingers, right? Because after it rises and does its thing, we're going to be rolling it out into long coils. And we want the coils to stand up on their own, be independent. Create beautiful challah. I'm going to stick my hands back in the flour. Sorry. Now you know, if you come to my house, your flour will probably have some challah dough wrapped up in it. Go. Let me just kind of keep going like this until it's not sticky. So I'll take this opportunity to talk a little bit about why vegan. Well, I've always been an animal lover, and I've gone through periods of time in my life where I've been vegetarian, where I've been pescatarian, and truth be told, my body has never really liked dairy. You know, we sort of make that joke that there's like the Jewish gastrointestinal. Ironically, I think I get it from my non-Jewish side as well as my Jewish side. But dairy, not great for me. And so when maybe 2 or 3 years ago, I developed some food aversions while pregnant. My first food aversion was to raw red meat while preparing some. And so I said, okay, I'm not going to eat that anymore. And then I have some friends who are like, yeah, we don't eat mammals because we really love mammals. And I thought, oh, that works for me too. I really love mammals. And so I stopped eating mammals altogether and I continued to eat chicken. Well, then I was in Hawaii, and if you've ever been to Hawaii, you know there's lots of wild chickens, especially on Kauai. And that's my dog when my hands are clean, I'll let him in. And I saw all these chickens wandering around with their babies, and I was sitting there eating chicken, looking at these mama chickens and their baby chickens, and I just couldn't do it anymore. And I have some dear friends here in Seattle who've been vegan for a while, and every time we get together, they would sort of tell me another horrific thing about egg production and how chickens really aren't supposed to make as many eggs as we've bred them to make, et cetera, et cetera. And it just, about a year ago, I figured, you know what? I'm just going to give it all up. Dairy makes me feel sick. Eggs are a really, intimate item that belongs to a chicken, and I don't really want to eat those anymore. And so I had to give up challah too, because I didn't know how to get vegan challah, and it was not at a time in my life when I was baking. Okay, this dough is pretty much together. It's still a little sticky, but you see it's got that nice like texture where it's coming together, but you've still got some movement to it. You don't really need this dough, I think probably because you work it so much in this stage. So yeah, okay. Flour over here. Now our final step before we rest the dough for a little while is to put it in a rising bowl. I like to use my glass bowl. I don't know why. I'm sure there's some reason behind it. But in the glass bowl, we're going to take some coconut oil and just a little drizzle to coat the sides. Grab a little paper napkin here. We're going to coat the sides of this bowl. Now go ahead and coat it all the way up to the top, because if we're lucky, our dough will get a really nice high rise. So clean bowl, coconut oil on the sides so the dough doesn't stick. And we're just going to transfer dough into that nice clean bowl. See, doesn't that look lovely? It's about the aesthetic too. And then I'm going to cover it with a tea towel and let it rise for a good long while. We're going to let it rest and rise for 2 hours. So I'll meet you back here in 2 hours, and we'll see what happens with our dough. All right. Hi, welcome back. It's been a little more than 2 hours, so we'll see what happened to our dough. But now is the time that actually brings a lot of people anxiety. It's the time where we punch down the dough. That's not the anxiety-provoking part, but we braid the dough into the challah itself. I think that that's actually a really fun part. It kind of doesn't matter what your loaf looks like. We're going to be doing a round loaf today, so we'll practice that technique. But there is a piece to this puzzle which actually makes challah challah that isn't often listed in challah recipes. So challah literally means to be taken. And the act of making something, not just a loaf of bread, but challah, harkens back to the days when the temple stood in Jerusalem, and we would bring offerings to the temple. We would bring offerings that would be burnt and offerings that would go to the priests to feed the Levites, because they didn't have land and they didn't have livestock and they didn't have the ability to feed themselves. The community had to feed them. So we remember those sacrifices by making challah, and we take a little bit of challah. So I'm going to demonstrate that for you. There is, of course, a blessing, because there's a blessing whenever we do something sacred or special that is mindful. And the intention that I'm bringing in this today for this new year in taking challah is, I think, the reminder of all of those things in our lives that we take a little bit away from ourselves to give to someone else. It can be really heavy-handed and talk about wearing masks. See, I just did it. That's probably preaching to the choir. So I invite you to just, as you're making your challah for this Yom Kippur, for this Yom Kippur break the fast, or whenever you're making challah, what is it that you're taking a little bit from your own pot to put into somebody else's? So I'm going to turn the camera back towards our challah. We'll see how it's risen, and we'll do the stuff for this next step. So here we go. All right, let's get our framing right. There's my board. I don't have a really great rolling space in my kitchen right now, so I just use my cutting board as a clean space in which to roll things out. So here is our challah dough, and yeah, it's like pretty much filled the entire bowl. I have been a better human being, a cleaner human being, and put some flour in this bowl, so I'm not reaching into the flour bag like I did last time. So I'm just gonna get a little bit of flour on my hands. Piece of dough is kind of sticky. Flour's kind of our friend right now, and I'm just gonna punch it down a couple of times. Again, it doesn't really need to be kneaded, but we just want to get some of that air out of there, and it's going to rise again after we braid it, so it's going to get lots of good oxygen in there. So I'll move this bowl to the side, and actually I got to put some flour down on the board before we put the challah down. Just a little zigzag and a shmush. All right, and before we go into separating the challah, the first piece that we do is to take challah. So the blessing is Baruch Atah Adonai Eloheinu Melech HaOlam Asher Kidshanu B'mitzvotav V'tzivanu Lehafrish Challah. And the tradition tells us to take an ounce. It also, there's another tradition that says about the size of an olive. So here's our challah. We are going to bake this and sort of, in essence, burn it in the oven. So now we have our loaf, and we've got to divide it. And I actually have a fancy pastry divider. I forgot to grab it. So grab that real quick. I've been using a knife for many weeks, and it works, but if you have access to one of these pastry paddles, I highly recommend it. It gives you a much cleaner cut. So, okay, I don't have a kitchen scale. I eyeball it, you know, to each their own. So for our loaf today, we're just going to do a 4-strand, and we're going to cut it. So cut it in half. My dough is a little sticky, so we're going to add some more flour to it as we're working it. Half, and then, you know, half again. I'll do it this way to kind of get a little bit more even halves. Half, half, set them aside. Another half here, let's see you. There we go, seems about half, yeah, okay, cool. Now, I will demonstrate the coiling method. Every time I coil my challah, I am thrown back to elementary school art class, ceramics in particular, when we learned how to make coil pots. Now, because of that, this is how I start my coil. I like to start it in between my hands to kind of let gravity do some of its thing. It sort of stretches it out a little, turn it upside down, get it coiling a little bit before I get the board involved. My board shifts around, so it's not super great. If I had wooden countertops, I would recommend using that instead. See, there we go, movement. But as you coil, you know, it's not a precise science. It's a lot of like push and roll. You want to get some friction in there, so sometimes too much flour on the board is not your friend. But I'm going to push and roll. Try to get them sort of even. Truth be told, once we start braiding, the evenness of the coils is like really not all that essential, especially for the round challah. The round challah that we're going to do today is really quite forgiving, and it looks very beautiful kind of no matter what your coils look like. So here we go. There we go, one coil, kind of the diagonal length of my board, and I just stretch. I mean, you know, it's my challah. I can do what I want. I'm gonna pause us here as I go ahead and do the rest of these, and then we'll come back together for the actual braiding. Okay, so we have our 4 strands here. Now, this is actually a woven round loaf. If you wanted to use this on any other Shabbat, you can go ahead and do, YouTube has the best ideas for how to braid chalot. You can just do a simple 3-strand braid. You can coil it up and make little, you know, rolls. You can do whatever you want with it. It's your challah. So for this in particular, now my coils are not exactly the same length. That's just kind of what it is. I'm gonna take the 2 shorter ones actually. Let's see. We're going to set it up like a crisscross hashtag, whatever you want to call it. Yeah, like this. Okay, now for the braiding itself, let's see if I can get you a better angle. That might help a little bit. So we set it up crisscross like this, just 2 on top, 2 underneath. And then I take the one on the left and I put it under to begin our weave, move it a little bit closer. And then because this one is underneath, I'm gonna put the top underneath up here. So the thing to remember as you're braiding is it's just kind of working in opposites. So we're gonna start going clockwise. We're gonna start going counterclockwise. So anything that's underneath is what goes on top. So this underneath one goes to the on top. And then in this next pair, the underneath goes to on top. This next pair, the underneath, on top, and you guessed it, underneath, on top. Now, the neat thing about this method is that we then go back the other way around. So we have a new pair, underneath and on top. So underneath, on top, fantastic. Underneath, on top. You get the idea. It took me a couple of tries to figure this out, and that's okay. You can take as many tries as you want. If you got to this point and you were like, oh, that doesn't look good, you could undo the whole thing. No harm, no foul. It's pretty forgiving bread. This is not the Great British Baking Show. There's no Paul Hollywood that's going to be critiquing you. It's just you. So underneath to on top, and then we shift the other way around. Once we get to the outside, we start to stretch the dough a little bit so that we can have a little bit more to work with for our braid. Underneath to on top. At this point, this is just a mantra for me. Underneath to on top. And then underneath to on top. And then when we get to this point where we just kind of have like little feet, that's when we can do probably one last and then kind of pinch the ends and tuck them underneath. the women who created or who shared this challah recipe from Challah Hub in Los Angeles, which is a challah delivery service, Sarah Klegman says, you know, the beauty of the challah is you can just kind of tuck everything underneath and then voila, challah. My challah always winds up a little lopsided. I don't care. It's delicious. My family doesn't really seem to mind. My kid sure doesn't. So there is our challah. Tilt the camera a little bit so you can see that aerial view. Got that braid there. Now we're gonna let it rise for 1 more hour. So you'll want to take a baking pan. I think this is like a liner for a roast, which is kind of funny because I don't eat roasts anymore, but I really like it for my challah, especially the round challah, because it sort of has an indentation here, gives it some space to do its work. And here I have a Silpat baking mat. If you don't have a baking mat, you can just line, you can either line your baking sheet with parchment paper or take some more of that coconut oil and just line the bottom there. You know, you just want something that's gonna not stick, essentially. And then the very careful work of taking the braid and transporting it, right? Boom, there we go. Little stuck together. So then we're gonna cover it back up with the tea towel and let it rest and rise for 1 more hour. And then we're going to bake it. So 1 hour, I'll come back to talk baking instructions.
All right. So it's been an hour and we're gonna uncover our loaf, which for me, still a little lopsided on this side. I don't know why I'm pointing out all the imperfections, but that's okay. So we're gonna preheat our oven to 325. So my oven is preheating. Hopefully it will finish up when it's time to put this in there. And I'm going to take the remainder of my coconut oil. See, I'm at the bottom of my barrel here. Best way that I've found to heat up coconut oil, you can put it in the microwave, or I just do like a double boiler makeshift situation with a pot of water on my stove. Just stick that in there and then it gets nice and liquid. So our last step is to coat the braided loaf with some coconut oil. Now this would do kind of what an egg wash would do. It's not going to get shiny like an egg wash will give you a nice shiny challah, but it gives the challah a nice brown, golden sort of, you know, outer crust, and it doesn't have eggs, which is the main ingredient here for me, is for it to not have eggs. Earlier in the pandemic, when I started actually baking challah and looking for vegan challah recipes, I believe it was in our Temple Diver Sinai community Facebook group. I got all sorts of suggestions for different washes to do, different egg-free washes to do for the challah. Dairy-free coffee creamer is one that was suggested and one that I've tried, and that works, you know, beautifully too. But since this recipe calls for so much coconut oil anyway, I have it on hand. I'm going to be really generous with the coconut oil this time. I usually just do kind of a slight brushing, but I want to see what happens if we're really generous with the coconut oil. And then we're going to bake it. So, aha, perfect. Oven is ready. So here's the thing with the baking. Hi, welcome back. Everybody's oven is different. My oven is a little temperamental and it's not really as hot as I want it to be. So the recipe calls for baking it at 325 for 25 to 35 minutes. When I do that, it gets really underbaked and doughy, which is like kind of yummy and also kind of not yummy. It's okay because there's no eggs in it. Last week I tried at 45 minutes. It was a little overbaked for my liking. So this week I'm gonna try 325 for 40 minutes. So I'm gonna go ahead and put this beautiful, if I do say so myself, loaf in the oven and check it out in 40 minutes. And in the meantime, I'm gonna set up a cooling rack so that when it's done, I can take it out of the oven and pop it right on the rack to cool. Well, there you have it. Challah. I took a page out of another sort of baking handbook, which is to take a toothpick and stick it into the middle of the
loaf in this instance, I only had a chopstick to pull it out to make sure the dough isn't wet, just because I've had such inconsistencies with baking. But there it is, the vegan challah that we will eat tonight as we welcome in Rosh Hashanah. So I hope that you get the opportunity to make it for Yom Kippur, break the fast, and that you, if you are not already in a plant-based vegan lifestyle, that you might find some interest in it. And I'm sure we'll talk about it a little bit more because I didn't really go into too much detail. But that's my vegan challah. Shana Tova.